Get that illegal Mexican away from me and my baby. Karen Mitchell's voice carried through the Amtrak train car as she clutched her 80-month-old daughter, Emma, closer, glaring at the Latino man in a janitor's uniform who was quietly cleaning the aisle near her seat. I don't want someone like him anywhere near my child. He probably doesn't even have proper hygiene or understand basic cleanliness. What Karen didn't know, what this entitled suburban mother from Connecticut was too busy being xenophobic to notice, was that the illegal Mexican janitor she was demanding stay away from her baby was actually Juan Rodriguez, one of Mexico City and most experienced pediatric emergency room nurses who saved over 500 children just lives during 12 years of practice. Now reduced to cleaning train cars because the United States would not recognize his nursing credentials despite his expertise far exceeding most American pediatric nurses. And what Karen definitely didn't realize was that in approximately 30 minutes, her baby would start choking violently on a snack. The train staff would know proper infant Heimlich technique. And the only thing standing between Emma and potential death would be the dirty illegal whose medical expertise Karen had been loudly insulting for the past hour. Bro, you see, I was actually on that exact Amtrak train, the Silver Star route from Miami to New York. That takes about 30 hours, heading back north after wrapping up a security consultation for a hotel chain in South Florida. I'd boarded in Fort Lauderdale and settled into my coach seat around 2 p.m., planning to use the long journey for some reading and people watching. And brother, there was plenty to watch, because Karen Mitchell had been creating a scene since boarding in West Palm Beach, making sure everyone within earshot knew exactly how she felt about the Latino cleaning staff working the train, you know? Before I tell you how Karen, this baby-ass medical emergency, revealed that the illegal janitor she'd been tormenting was actually more qualified to save her child than the pediatrician she probably paid hundreds of dollars to see in Connecticut. Let me ask you something that probably hits home for a lot of folks. Have you ever witnessed someone treating immigrant workers with open contempt? Making assumptions about legal status and competence based purely on appearance and accent, only to discover those workers were highly educated professionals doing survival jobs. Drop your city and country in the comments and share stories about qualified immigrants you've met working jobs far below their actual expertise. Because of what happened on that Amtrak train is going to show you exactly why assumptions about people based on their current work uniform can be dangerously, even fatally wrong. And hey, real quick before I get deep into this story, I got to give a shout out to Carmen Silva from Houston, Texas, and David Park from Portland, Oregon, who've been consistently engaging with our videos and sharing their own immigrant professional stories. Carmen, your comment about your father, who was a civil engineer in El Salvador, but worked construction in Texas, really resonated with a lot of people. And David, appreciate you sharing how your mother, who was a pharmacist in Korea, ended up working as a cashier for 15 years. Y'all keep those stories coming. They matter because they remind people that human worth isn't determined by job titles or immigration status, bro. Now, if you'll pardon an old man for taking a moment here to settle into this chair and get comfortable with my coffee. Cases where highly qualified medical professionals end up in service jobs, while trying to navigate impossible licensing barriers, always hit me particularly hard. At my age, having worked security in medical facilities, transportation hubs, and public spaces for over 40 years, I've encountered countless immigrant nurses, doctors, and paramedics working as cleaners, drivers, or food service workers because American licensing systems make it nearly impossible to practice medicine even when their qualifications match or exceed domestic standards. Thank you for staying with Uncle Sam as I tell you about one of the most dramatic demonstrations I ever witnessed of why judging people by their current circumstances rather than their actual capabilities can literally cost lives. To understand how Juan Rodriguez ended up cleaning train cars despite being one of Mexico's most experienced pediatric emergency nurses, we got to go back about 10 years to when his life in Mexico City became untenable and he made the desperate decision to leave behind his thriving nursing career, his reputation at one of Latin America's premier children's hospitals, and his entire professional identity to seek safety and stability in the United States for his family. Juan had been born in Guadalajara in 1983. Growing up in a working-class Mexican family during the country's economic difficulties of the 1980s, his father worked as a mechanic, his mother as a teacher's aide, and Juan had been drawn to healthcare from childhood, the kind of kid who carefully bandaged his younger siblings' scraped knees and read medical textbooks from the library instead of comic books. He'd excelled in school despite limited resources, earning admission to Universidad Nacional Autónoma de Mexico's nursing program at age 18. Nursing in Mexico is a respected profession requiring serious academic training, Juan had explained to me during our conversation after the incident on the train. It's not like some people in the US think that nurses are just assistants who follow doctors' orders. We have 4-year university degrees, clinical rotations, national licensing exams, specialization training. I spent 6 years total becoming a pediatric emergency nurse, 4 years basic nursing, 2 years pediatric emergency specialization. Juan's clinical training had been completed at Hospital Infantil de Mexico Federico Gomez, one of Latin America's premier pediatric hospitals, where he'd rotated through every department treating children from birth through adolescence. He'd specialized in pediatric emergency care, the high-pressure, fast-paced environment where critically ill or injured children needed immediate assessment and intervention to survive. It required exceptional clinical judgment, the ability to perform procedures on tiny bodies where millimeters mattered, staying calm under extreme pressure, and communicating with terrified parents in the worst moments of their lives. By 2010, at age 27, Juan had established himself as one of Hospital Infantil's most skilled pediatric emergency nurses. He'd managed thousands of pediatric emergencies, respiratory distress, cardiac events, seizures, traumas, poisonings, every crisis that could affect children. His specialization was airway emergencies, choking, anaphylaxis, respiratory failure, situations where seconds determined whether children lived or died. He'd performed hundreds of emergency airway clearances on choking infants and children. His success rate near perfect because he'd mastered techniques that required both technical skill and calm decisiveness. Pediatric airway emergencies are uniquely challenging, Juan had told me. Adult Heimlich technique doesn't work on infants. Their anatomy is completely different. Their bodies are fragile. You can easily cause internal damage if you don't know exactly what you're doing. I'd been trained by some of Mexico's best pediatric emergency physicians, and I'd performed the procedure so many times that it was muscle memory. I could assess a choking infant, determine the appropriate intervention, and execute it in under 30 seconds. But Mexico City's escalating violence in Juan's growing family had made continuing that life increasingly difficult. By 2015, cartel violence had reached levels where healthcare workers were being targeted, kidnapped for ransom, threatened to treat cartel members without reporting to authorities, sometimes caught in crossfire when gang members brought wounded associates to emergency rooms. Juan's hospital had been raided multiple times. Staff had been threatened, and several colleagues had been killed or kidnapped. The breaking point came when my wife Rosa was 7 months pregnant with our second child. Juan had explained. Armed men came to the hospital looking for a patient we treated, a cartel member who'd been injured in a shootout. They threatened staff, waved weapons around the emergency room with children present, made it clear they'd return if we ever reported treating cartel injuries. After that, Rosa said we needed to leave Mexico before our children grew up in that violence. Juan and Rosa had left Mexico City in early 2016, entering the United States with tourist visas and their 2 young children, daughter Lucia, age 4, son Miguel, age 2 months. They'd applied for asylum based on the violence targeting healthcare workers, and while that application was processed, Juan had tried to validate his nursing credentials so he could continue working in pediatric emergency care. What Juan discovered was that the United States nursing licensing system, supposedly designed to ensure competent care, but functioning primarily to protect American nurses from foreign competition, made it nearly impossible for internationally trained nurses to practice even when their qualifications matched or exceeded U.S. standards. I had to have my Mexican nursing degree evaluated by a credential assessment agency, which cost $500 and took 4 months, Juan had explained. Then I had to pass the NCLEXRN exam, the National Council Licensure Examination for registered nurses, which cost another $400 plus study materials. But the NCLEX is designed for American nursing education, testing things like U.S. healthcare policy and American drug brand names that I never learned because I trained in Mexico. Even after passing NCLEX, Juan had continued, I needed to complete additional clinical hours in a U.S. healthcare setting before I could get licensed. But hospitals wouldn't hire me for clinical rotations because I wasn't licensed yet. It was a catch-22. I needed U.S. clinical experience to get licensed, but I needed a license to get clinical experience. Meanwhile, I had 12 years of pediatric emergency nursing, including specializations American nurses rarely have. Juan's asylum application had taken 3 years to process, during which he couldn't legally work and survived on savings that rapidly depleted. When he'd finally received his work authorization in 2019, he'd been desperate for any income while continuing to study for the NCLEX exam and navigate the Byzantine licensing requirements. He'd applied for nursing assistant positions, jobs that didn't require an licensure, but would let him work in healthcare. But even those required certifications he didn't have and training programs he couldn't afford. I was running out of money. My family was. Living in a one-bedroom apartment in New Jersey with another family, and I needed work immediately, Juan had explained. A friend told me Amtrak was hiring cleaning staff for trains. The pay was decent at $17 per hour. They didn't require special certifications, and the schedule was flexible so I could study for licensing exams during off hours. So, Juan Rodriguez, pediatric emergency nurse who'd saved hundreds of children's lives, became Juan the trained janitor who emptied trash and mopped floors. The psychological toll of that transition had been devastating. Juan would work his cleaning shifts on Amtrak as long-distance routes, sometimes the Silver Star from Miami to New York, sometimes the Crescent from New Orleans to D.C., then returned to his cramped apartment and studied pediatric nursing journals to maintain his clinical knowledge. He'd practice airway emergency techniques on dolls his children played with, keeping his skills sharp even though he couldn't legally use them. He'd watch American parents struggle with basic first aid during minor incidents on trains, wanting desperately to help but worried that revealing his medical background might raise questions about why a nurse was cleaning trains. The hardest part wasn't the loss of income or status, Juan had told me. It was knowing I had skills that children desperately needed, that I'd spent my entire adult life developing expertise in saving kids' lives. And I was legally prohibited from using that expertise because American licensing boards assumed foreign nursing training was automatically inferior, regardless of actual competence or outcomes. I deboarded the train that September afternoon with no idea I'd witnessed such a dramatic demonstration of exactly what Juan was describing. I had settled into my coach seat around row 15, positioning myself where I had good sight lines of the car, old security habits that never really fade, even during routine travel. The train had been moderately full, mix of tourists, business travelers, families making the long journey up the East Coast. Karen Mitchell had boarded in West Palm Beach with her daughter Emma, settling into seats a few rows ahead of me. I noticed her immediately because she'd been complaining loudly from the moment. She had entered the train about the seat configuration, about other passengers being too close, about the temperature, about everything. She'd been that particular type of entitled passenger that service workers dread, someone who views any minor inconvenience as a personal affront and treats staff like servants who exist solely to anticipate her needs. Juan had been working the cleaning shift for our car, moving through with his cart collecting trash, wiping down surfaces, generally maintaining cleanliness during the long journey. He'd been professional and unobtrusive, the way good service workers are, present when needed, invisible when not. His uniform was neat despite the nature of cleaning work, his demeanor courteous when passengers acknowledged him, his efficiency suggesting someone who took pride in doing his job well, even though it was far beneath his actual qualifications. Karen's hostile reaction to Juan had started almost immediately when he approached her row to empty the trash. She'd visibly recoiled when she'd seen him, pulling Emma closer like Juan represented some kind of threat simply by being a Latino man in a janitor's uniform. "Excuse me, I need to empty your trash," Juan had said politely, his English fluent, but carrying the accent that Karen had apparently decided meant he was dangerous or incompetent or both. "Just hurry up and don't touch my things." Karen had responded coldly, watching Juan's every movement like she expected him to steal something. After he'd moved on, she'd made loud comments to nearby passengers about the type of people they hire for these jobs and wondering if they even check if they read legal. I felt my jaw tighten watching this interaction. I've spent decades observing how people treat service workers, and Karen's casual cruelty was revealing in exactly the way that exposed his character. But Juan had simply continued his work with professional dignity, giving no indication that Karen's xenophobia affected him, even though it almost certainly did. Over the next hour, as the train progressed north through Florida, Karen had continued her pattern of hostile treatment toward Juan and making sure other passengers heard her opinions about immigrant workers. When Juan had returned to clean the bathroom near her seat, Karen had made loud comments about hoping he knows proper hygiene procedures given where he's from. When he'd restocked supplies, she'd muttered about illegal Mexicans taking jobs from Americans who actually deserved them. When he passed her row, carrying cleaning supplies, she'd pulled Emma away dramatically and told her daughter, "Don't get near him, honey. We don't know where he's been." "Ma'am, I'm just doing my job," Juan had said quietly after one particularly harsh comment. "I'm not trying to bother you or your daughter. I'm simply maintaining cleanliness for all passengers. Get that illegal Mexican away from me and my baby." Karen had responded loudly enough that half the car could hear, "I don't want someone like him anywhere near my child. He probably doesn't even have proper hygiene or understand basic cleanliness. Don't they do background checks on these people before letting them work around families?" "I assure you, ma'am, Amtrak does thorough background checks on all employees," Juan had replied. Maintaining composure despite Karen's explicit racism, "I am legally authorized to work in the United States. I have passed all required screening, and I take hygiene very seriously. I'm sorry if my presence makes you uncomfortable, but I'm simply performing my assigned duties." "Your assigned duties should keep you away from decent families," Karen had shot back. "Stick to the areas where you belong and leave the passenger sections for people who actually pay to ride this train." That comment had been particularly rich, given that Juan was literally employed to be in passenger sections. But Karen's bigotry wasn't constrained by logic. Several other passengers had looked uncomfortable with Karen's behavior, but nobody had said anything. The common dynamic where people disapprove of racism but don't want the confrontation that comes with calling it out publicly. "I apologize for the disturbance," Juan had said to the passengers around Karen, then moved on with his cleaning cart, his expression neutral but his body language carrying tension from absorbing yet another racist assault while just trying to do his job. I'd considered saying something to Karen about her treatment of Juan, but decades of experience had taught me that people like her rarely respond well to being called out by strangers. She'd just get defensive, claim she wasn't being racist, but rather reasonably concerned about safety, and probably escalate her hostility toward Juan in retaliation. Sometimes the best thing you can do is document what is happening and be ready to intervene if situations turn from verbal abuse to physical threat. The train had continued north through Florida, passengers settling in for the long journey. Karen had kept Emma entertained with snacks and videos on a tablet, occasionally making additional comments about the quality of staff whenever Juan was visible in the car. Juan had continued his work with professional detachment, though I noticed him taking particular care to avoid Karen's immediate area, except when his duties absolutely required it. About 2 hours into the journey, somewhere around Fort Pierce, this situation that would expose Karen's bigotry and Juan's hidden expertise had begun developing. Emma had been eating some kind of snack, looked like maybe dried fruit or granola, when she suddenly started coughing in that wet, gasping way that indicates something stuck in a child's airway. Most parents have experienced their kids choking on food, and usually it resolves quickly as the child coughs it up or swallows it down. But Emma's coughing hadn't resolved. It had escalated quickly from normal food caught and throat coughing to the silent, panicked choking, where no air is moving and the child's face starts changing color. Karen had recognized something was seriously wrong and started patting Emma's back frantically. The natural parental response that that's actually the wrong intervention for serious choking. "My baby's choking." Karen had screamed, her voice cracking with terror. "Somebody help. She can't breathe." The train car had erupted in that particular chaos that happens during unexpected medical emergencies in public spaces. Passengers had turned toward the commotion. Several people had moved to help. Someone had pressed the emergency call button to alert train staff. Emma had been turning red, then purple, her mouth open in silent, desperate attempts to breathe, her tiny hands clutching at her throat in the universal choking gesture. A conductor had arrived within 30 seconds. Having been in the adjacent car when the emergency call came through. "Ma'am, is she choking? Can she breathe at all?" "No." "She's not breathing. Do something." Karen had been losing it, understandably terrified as her daughter to darker purple, and Emma's struggles started becoming weaker as oxygen deprivation progressed. The conductor had tried to perform back blows on Emma, but his technique had been wrong. He'd been using adult Heimlich positioning on an 18-month-old infant whose body mechanics were completely different. The blows hadn't been generating enough force to dislodge whatever Emma had aspirated, and they were positioned wrong for an infant's anatomy. It's not working, Karen had screamed. She's dying. Oh my god, my baby's dying. Emma had indeed been dying. Her lips were blue-black now. She'd have suffered permanent brain damage or death if someone didn't clear her airway immediately using proper infant airway emergency technique. That's when Juan had pushed through the crowd of passengers, dropping his cleaning supplies and moving with the purposeful efficiency of someone who handled exactly this emergency hundreds of times before. Let me help, Juan had said firmly, his hands already reaching for Emma. I know what to do. Get away from my daughter. Karen had initially resisted, even in her panic reacting to Juan as the illegal Mexican janitor. She'd been insulting rather than recognizing he might actually be qualified to help. Ma'am, your daughter is dying, Juan had said, with calm authority that cut through Karen's hysteria. She's not breathing, she's unconscious, and she'll have permanent brain damage in about 60 seconds if I don't clear her airway right now. I'm a pediatric emergency room nurse. I've saved hundreds of choking children. You need to let me help her immediately. The combination of Emma's obviously critical condition and Juan's confident medical authority had broken through Karen's resistance. She'd handed Emma to Juan, and what happened next had been a masterclass in pediatric emergency medicine performed by someone who done this exact procedure so many times it was pure muscle memory. Juan had immediately positioned Emma correctly for infant choking intervention, face down along his forearm, head lower than chest, supporting her jaw and head with his hand. His other hand had delivered 5 precise back blows between Emma's shoulder blades, angled correctly to generate maximum force toward the obstruction without damaging her tiny organs. Come on, baby, cough it up, Juan had murmured while performing the intervention with textbook perfect technique. After the back blows didn't immediately dislodge the obstruction, he'd flipped Emma onto her back along his other forearm, positioned his fingers correctly for infant chest thrusts, 2 fingers in the center of her chest, compression depth exactly right for an 18-month-old's anatomy, and delivered 5 rapid thrusts. Nothing. Emma was completely limp now, no longer struggling because she didn't have consciousness to struggle with. Her face was dark purple-black, her lips almost navy blue. She looked dead. She's not responding. The conductor had said, his voice carrying panic that Juan's didn't. One more cycle, Juan had said calmly, flipping Emma back to face-down position. I can feel the obstruction moving. It's coming. He delivered another 5 back blows, and on the 4th one, a wet choking sound had come from Emma's throat. The 5th blow had dislodged a large piece of dried mango, the snack Emma had been eating, sending it flying from her mouth onto the train floor. Emma had immediately gasped, a huge shuddering breath that brought air into lungs that had been deprived for nearly 2 minutes. And then she started crying. The most beautiful sound any parent can hear after their child has been choking. She's breathing, Juan had said, quickly checking Emma's color as pink slowly returned to her face, monitoring her respiratory rate and effort, assessing for any signs of residual airway compromise. The obstruction is cleared completely. Her airway is patent and she's moving air well. She's going to be okay. Karen had taken Emma from Juan, sobbing with relief and terror and the aftermath of adrenaline, holding her daughter while Emma continued crying that indicated she was breathing fine, that oxygen was reaching her brain, that she'd survived what had been seconds away from being a fatal choking incident. The train car had erupted in applause and relieved reactions. Passengers who'd been watching the terrifying emergency unfold now expressing gratitude and amazement at Juan's successful intervention. Several people had been filming on their phones, the modern reflex during any dramatic event, capturing Juan's perfect pediatric Heimlich technique and Emma's revival. You saved her life, the conductor had said to Juan, his own hand shaking from the stress of watching a child nearly die on his train. How did you know exactly what to do? That was incredible. I'm a pediatric emergency room nurse, Juan had explained, his voice still carrying the calm authority of medical professional mode. Or I was in Mexico. I'm not licensed to practice in the US yet. I performed that exact procedure hundreds of times on choking infants and children. It's called the infant Heimlich maneuver, different from adult technique, because baby's anatomy requires different positioning and force. The information had been sinking in for everyone who'd witnessed what just happened, particularly for Karen, whose daughter was alive because of the illegal Mexican janitor. She'd spent an hour insulting and demanding stay away from her baby. The irony was so obvious that even she couldn't miss it. Though her expression suggested she was struggling to process the cognitive dissonance. "You're a nurse?" Karen had finally managed, looking at Juan in his janitor's uniform with confusion and dawning horror about what she'd been saying to the man who'd just saved Emma Death's life. Pediatric emergency nurse, Juan had confirmed. 12 years of practice in Mexico City at one of Latin America's premier children's hospitals. I specialized in airway emergencies, choking, anaphylaxis, respiratory failure. I've saved over 500 children during my career. But in the United States, my nursing credentials aren't recognized because I trained in Mexico. So I clean trains while I try to get licensed here, which has been an 8-year process so far with no resolution. But, you saved my daughter's life, Corinne had said, tears streaming down her face as she held Emma. You knew exactly what to do when the train staff didn't. You're clearly incredibly skilled and experienced. I am, Juan had agreed simply. But American nursing boards don't care about my skills or experience. They care about where I got my degree and whether it's from an American institution. So one of Mexico's most experienced pediatric emergency nurses works as a train janitor, while American children die from lack of access to qualified pediatric specialists. That's the system. The conductor had been on the radio with Amtrak dispatch and paramedics, arranging for Emma to be checked by. They want to evaluate her to make sure there's no residual airway damage or aspiration pneumonia risk. Emergency medical services at the next station stop in about 40 minutes, he'd explained to Karen. But the paramedic I spoke to said the technique you used was textbook perfect. You probably saved not just her life, but prevented brain damage from oxygen deprivation. Now, before I continue with what happened after the train reached the next station and how this incident eventually impacted both Juana's licensing journey and Karen Des' perspective on immigrants, let me pause here for a quick request. If you're getting value from this story about a pediatric nurse forced to clean trains while trying to validate his credentials, do Uncle Sam a favor and hit that subscribe button right now. We've got tons more stories about highly qualified immigrant professionals working survival jobs while facing discrimination from people who have no clue about their actual expertise. And drop a comment telling me if you've witnessed or experienced similar situations. Skilled medical professionals working non-medical jobs because of licensing barriers, nurses or doctors whose foreign credentials aren't recognized, immigrants with life-saving expertise that America refuses to utilize. These stories matter, and your engagement helps them reach people who need to understand how broken our professional licensing systems are, The train had continued to the next station, Fort Lauderdale, where paramedics had boarded to evaluate Emma. They'd been impressed by Juan's intervention and documentation of what had happened, with one paramedic commenting that Juan's technique had been better than many EMTs he'd worked with. He said, "You're a pediatric nurse?" The lead paramedic had asked Juan while checking Emma's vital signs and airway. "Your intervention was flawless. Positioning, force, cycling between back blows and chest thrusts. Most people panic and either don't compress hard enough or compress too hard and cause internal injuries. You clearly knew exactly what you were doing." 12 years in pediatric emergency medicine in Mexico City, Juan had confirmed, "I've handled probably 300 choking cases. It becomes muscle memory after you've done it enough times." The key with infants is using their body as the compression surface instead of your hand, getting the angle right so gravity helps, and knowing exactly how much force their tiny rib cages can tolerate. "You should be working in a pediatric ER," the paramedic had observed. "We desperately need experienced pediatric nurses. Most ERs struggle with pediatric emergencies because staff don't get enough exposure to perfect techniques on tiny patients. I love to work in pediatric emergency care." Juan had replied, "But I've been trying to get my nursing license validated for 8 years. The system makes it nearly impossible for foreign nurses to practice even when we have more experience than American-trained nurses." Emma had been cleared medically. No damage to her airway, no signs of aspiration, vital signs normal. Just some throat soreness from a choking episode that would resolve in a day or two. The paramedics had recommended follow-up with her pediatrician, but confirmed she had made a complete recovery thanks to Juan's rapid and expert intervention. After the paramedics had left and the train had resumed its journey, several passengers had approached Juan to thank him, express amazement at his hidden expertise, and ask how a trained pediatric nurse ended up cleaning trains. Each conversation had reinforced the same frustrating reality that America was filled with highly qualified immigrant medical professionals working survival jobs because licensing systems prioritize protectionism over actually assessing competence. This happens constantly. One passenger, a social worker named Patricia, had told me during a conversation after the incident. I work with immigrant families, and I've met so many nurses, doctors, dentists, pharmacists working as home health aides, medical office clerks, or non-medical jobs entirely because they can't get licensed. Meanwhile, we have massive healthcare workforce shortages and patients dying from lack of access to care. It's insane. Karen had eventually approached Juan, several hours into the journey after Emma had fallen asleep and Karen had time to process what had happened. Her contrition had been obvious in her body language, shoulders hunched, unable to make eye contact, voice small and uncertain. "I need to apologize," Karen had said quietly, "for everything I said earlier, for how I treated you, for calling you illegal and saying you were dirty and demanding you stay away from my daughter. You saved Emma's life, and I'd spent an hour insulting you based on nothing except my own prejudice and ignorance." "Apology accepted," Juan had replied, though his voice carried the weariness of someone who'd received similar apologies. Before, always after his expertise had been proven. Never before when it might have prevented the mistreatment in the first place. "But I want you to understand something important. What you said to me today, that happens constantly to immigrants working service jobs. You see someone in a janitor uniform or cleaning toilets or serving food, and you make automatic assumptions that they're uneducated, probably here illegally, somehow less than you. But that janitor might be a nurse like me," Juan had continued. "That housekeeper might be a doctor. That Uber driver might be an engineer. That food service worker might be a teacher. We're redoing these jobs not because we lack education or skills, but because American credentialing systems don't recognize our qualifications, or because we're waiting for work authorization, or because we're re-supporting families while trying to validate credentials that take years and thousands of dollars to process. You only recognize my value after I saved your daughter's life," Juan had concluded. "But my value didn't change between when you were insulting me this morning and when Emma was choking this afternoon. I was the same person with the same expertise. What changed was whether you could see past your assumptions to recognize that expertise existed." Karen had nodded, tears streaming down her face. "You're right. I was terrible to you based on nothing except prejudice, and if you hadn't been here, if you hadn't known exactly what to do despite me trying to keep you away from Emma ... I don't even want to think about what would have happened. Your daughter would probably have died or suffered permanent brain damage," Juan had said bluntly. "The conductor didn't know proper infant Heimlich technique. Most people don't. It's specialized knowledge that requires training. If I hadn't been on this train, if you'd been successful in keeping the legal Mexican away from your family, Emma wouldn't have survived." The starkness of that reality, that Karen's xenophobia had nearly prevented her daughter, had seemed to hit her. She'd spent the rest of the journey mostly quiet, occasionally checking on sleeping Emma, and apparently processing the massive gap between her assumptions about Juan and his actual qualifications. I'd approached Juan during a break in his cleaning duties, introducing myself and explaining that I'd witnessed the whole situation from initial hostility through the dramatic rescue. We talked for about 30 minutes about his journey from respected pediatric nurse in Mexico to trained janitor in America, the impossible barriers of the licensing system, and the psychological toll of having expertise that people desperately needed but weren't allowed to use. "The frustrating part isn't even the financial loss or status decrease," Juan had told me. "It's the waste. I have skills that children need. I am exceptionally good at pediatric emergency care because I've vetted it thousands of times. But American licensing boards would rather I clean trains than help save kids' lives, because protecting American nurses from competition matters more to them than protecting children from preventable deaths. Today was the first time in 8 years I've been able to actually practice pediatric nursing," Juan had continued. "Not because the system finally recognized my qualifications, but because a child was literally dying, and today was the first time in 8 years I've been able to actually practice pediatric nursing," Juan had continued. "Not because the system finally recognized my qualifications, But because a child was literally dying and there was nobody else available who knew what to do, if that situation hadn't happened, I'd still be invisible, just another illegal Mexican, cleaning up after people who assume I'm too stupid to do anything more valuable. Have you made any progress with licensing? I'd asked. Some. Juan had replied with weary hope. I finally passed the NCLEX-RN exam last year on my third attempt. Not because I lack nursing knowledge, but because the test is designed around American healthcare systems and drug brand names I'd never encountered in Mexico. Now I need to complete supervised clinical hours in a U.S. healthcare facility. But finding a hospital willing to hire foreign nurses for clinical rotations is nearly impossible. They all say they don't have programs for internationally trained nurses. Meanwhile, Juan had added, American nursing schools are graduating nurses with maybe 6 months of actual clinical experience, and they can start working immediately. I have 12 years of intensive pediatric emergency experience, and I have to prove I'm competent by starting over from scratch. The system isn't about ensuring quality. It's about limiting supply to keep nursing salaries high and preventing foreign competition. The train had continued its journey north through Florida, Georgia, and to the Carolinas, with Juan returning to his cleaning duties while passengers who'd witnessed Emma's rescue looked at him with newfound respect and understanding. Several had asked for his contact information, saying they wanted to help him navigate the licensing process or connect him with hospitals that might value his experience. One passenger, Dr. Jennifer Martinez, an immigration attorney based in D.C., had been particularly interested in Juan's case. What happened today needs to be documented and publicized, she told Juan during a conversation near Savannah. You have a dramatic, undeniable demonstration that you're a highly skilled pediatric nurse whose expertise saved a child's life. That's exactly the kind of evidence that can break through bureaucratic resistance and force licensing boards to actually look at your qualifications, rather than just rejecting you automatically for foreign training. I've worked with dozens of immigrant medical professionals trying to get licensed, Dr. Martinez had continued. The barriers are designed to be impossible, requiring you to repeat training you've already completed, charging thousands in fees, creating catch-22 situations where you need experience to get licensed, but need a license to get experience. But cases like yours, with clear documentation of expertise and life-saving outcomes, can create pressure for reform. Dr. Martinez had offered to represent Juan pro bono in his licensing efforts, using today's incident as evidence that rejecting his credentials was harming public health by preventing a qualified pediatric nurse from practicing. Several passengers had provided written statements about what they'd witnessed. The conductor had filed an official incident report documenting Juan's intervention, and multiple videos had been recorded showing his textbook perfect technique. This is going to be my case study for why nursing licensing reform matters, Dr. Martinez had explained. Ron Rodriguez, experienced pediatric emergency nurse, forced to clean trains because American boards won't recognize Mexican credentials, saved choking infant on Amtrak using expertise those same boards claim isn't valid. The irony is too obvious to ignore. The train had reached Washington, D.C. around 9 p.m., where Karen and Emma were disembarking to catch a connection to Connecticut. Before leaving, Karen had approached Juan one final time, this time with genuine humility rather than defensive contrition. I don't know if this means anything, Karen had said, but I work in communications at a healthcare advocacy nonprofit. What happened today? My daughter nearly dying. You saving her life despite me treating you terribly. The waste of having someone with your expertise cleaning trains. I want to tell this story. With your permission, I'd like to write about it, share it with media contacts, use it to advocate for nursing licensing reform. Why would you do that? Juan had asked, genuinely curious whether Karen's change of heart was temporary guilt or something deeper. Because I was wrong, Karen had replied simply. Not just about you specifically, though. I was definitely wrong about you. But about immigrants generally, about making assumptions based on people's current jobs rather than their actual capabilities, about supporting policies that create barriers for foreign professionals while we complain about healthcare shortages. Today taught me that those attitudes can literally cost lives, almost cost my daughter's life. I want to do something meaningful with that lesson. Juan had agreed, and over the following weeks, Karen had written a widely shared essay about the incident that had appeared in multiple publications. The Mexican janitor who saved my daughter's life had generated millions of views and sparked broader conversations about immigrant professionals, credential validation barriers, and the human cost of protectionist licensing systems. I spent an hour insulting a man based purely on prejudice, written and written. I called him illegal, questioned his hygiene, demanded he stay away from my baby, all because he was Latino and wearing a janitor's uniform. Then my daughter started choking, and that same man used 12 years of pediatric emergency expertise to save her life with a technique so precise and perfect that paramedics called it textbook. The illegal Mexican I'd insulted was more qualified than most American pediatric nurses. And my daughter is alive because he happened to be on our train. But here's what haunts me, Currency had continued. What if I'd been successful in keeping him away from my family? What if my xenophobia had prevented him from helping when Emma was choking? She would have died or suffered permanent brain damage, and it would have been my fault for creating barriers between my child and the one person who could save her. That near miss has forced me to examine assumptions I didn't even know I held about immigrants, about service workers, about who deserves respect and recognition. The essay had gone viral, generating thousands of comments from people sharing similar stories of encountering highly educated immigrants working survival jobs. Nurses who'd been doctors in their home countries. Engineers driving Uber, teachers cleaning offices, lawyers working retail. Each story illustrated the same fundamental contradiction: America complaining about professional shortages while preventing qualified immigrants from using their expertise. The publicity around Juan's case had attracted attention from nursing advocacy groups, immigration reform organizations, and even some state legislators interested in reforming professional licensing barriers. Dr. Martinez had used the momentum to push for policy changes that would create streamlined pathways for internationally trained nurses to demonstrate competence rather than repeating years of training. The Juan Rodriguez case demonstrates everything wrong with our current system. Dr. Martinez had testified during a hearing in the Maryland State Legislature. We have an experienced pediatric emergency nurse cleaning trains because licensing boards won't recognize his Mexican credentials. Then a child starts choking on a train. American staff don't know proper infant Heimlich technique. And Juan saves the child's life using expertise the same licensing boards claim doesn't meet American standards. That contradiction should shame us into reform. The testimony had been accompanied by video of Juan's intervention, medical expert analysis confirming his technique was flawless, and statements from the paramedics who'd evaluated Emma praising Juan's clinical skills. The evidence had been compelling enough that Maryland became one of the first states to pass the legislation, creating expedited licensing pathways for internationally trained nurses who could demonstrate equivalent competence. What we're establishing, a bill's sponsor had explained, is competency-based assessment rather than credential-based rejection. If a foreign nurse can pass the same licensing exams as American nurses, demonstrate clinical skills through supervised practice, and show equivalent or superior outcomes, then we should license them regardless of where they trained. Juan Rodriguez's death case proves that rejecting foreign credentials is about protecting quality. It is about protecting American nurses from competition at the expense of public health. Juan had been among the first internationally trained nurses to benefit from Maryland's reformed licensing process. Within 6 months of the new law's passage, he'd completed supervised clinical hours, demonstrated his pediatric emergency expertise to evaluating physicians, and received his Maryland RN license 8 years after he started trying to practice nursing in America. I cried when I got the license, Juan had told me during a phone conversation after the approval came through. Not just because I could finally practice nursing again, but because it meant all those years of cleaning trains and being treated like I was worthless weren't for nothing. My expertise was finally being recognized, and I could go back to doing what I'd spent my life training for, saving children. Juan had been hired by a pediatric emergency department in Baltimore, bringing his 12-plus years of experience to treating critically ill and injured children. His clinical skills had immediately impressed colleagues, particularly his expertise in pediatric airway emergencies, where his technique and decision-making exceeded most American-trained pediatric nurses. When he is exceptional, his department director had commented during a performance review 6 months into his employment. His assessment skills are outstanding, his procedural technique is flawless, and his ability to stay calm during high-stress pediatric emergencies is exactly what we need. He is training our newer nurses in airway management because his expertise from Mexico exceeds anything they learned in American nursing schools. We're lucky to have him. That assessment had validated what Juan had always known, that his Mexican training and experience had made him a highly skilled pediatric nurse whose capabilities matched or exceeded American standards. The years he'd spent cleaning trains hadn't been because he lacked competence. They'd been because systematic barriers assumed foreign training was automatically inferior, regardless of actual skills or outcomes. 2 years after the train incident, Juan had been promoted to pediatric emergency charge nurse, supervising other nurses and coordinating responses to critical pediatric cases. He'd also become an advocate for nursing licensing reform, speaking at conferences about his experience and pushing for broader recognition of international nursing credentials. There are thousands of foreign-trained nurses in the United States working as nursing assistants, home health aides, or non-medical jobs entirely because they can't get licensed. Juan had explained during testimony before a congressional committee examining healthcare workforce issues. These are fully trained, often highly experienced nurses who could be addressing our nursing shortage, improving patient care, and bringing diverse clinical perspectives to American healthcare. Instead, we're wasting their expertise while patients suffer from inadequate nurse staffing. The argument that we need to repeat training to ensure quality doesn't hold up to scrutiny, Juan had continued. I had to prove my competence by passing the same exams as American nurses, demonstrating clinical skills through supervised practice, and showing that my patient outcomes met or exceeded standards. That's legitimate quality assurance. But requiring me to repeat 12 years of training I'd already completed, or rejecting my credentials automatically because I trained in Mexico, that's not quality assurance. It's protectionism. The congressional testimony had been part of broader advocacy efforts that were gradually generating momentum for nursing licensing reform at both state and federal levels. Several states beyond Maryland had passed similar expedited licensing pathways for internationally trained nurses. The National Council of State Boards of Nursing had begun exploring more flexible approaches to assessing foreign credentials, and healthcare systems facing severe nursing shortages were pushing for reforms that would allow them to hire qualified immigrant nurses. The Juan Rodriguez case has become our most powerful advocacy tool, explained Sarah Johnson, director of a nursing licensing reform organization. It's got everything: a sympathetic protagonist with undeniable expertise, a villain in the form of bureaucratic barriers, a dramatic life-saving moment that proves the protagonist's qualifications, and a clear policy solution. When we show legislators video of Juan saving that choking baby while wearing a janitor's uniform, then explain that licensing boards rejected his credentials despite that expertise, it makes the need for reform undeniable. Corinne Mitchell had remained involved in the advocacy work, using her platform and communications expertise to amplify stories of immigrant nurses and push for licensing reform. Her relationship with Juan had evolved from patient rescuer to something closer to colleagues, working toward the same goal, changing a system that had nearly cost Emma her life by preventing a qualified nurse from practicing. I think about that day constantly. Corinne had told me during a conversation 3 years after the incident. Not just the terror of watching Emma choke, though that's haunting enough, but the realization of how close my own prejudice came to killing my daughter. If Juan had listened to my demands that he stay away from us, if he decided that after an hour of my racist abuse he wasn't going to help when Emma needed him, she'd be dead or brain damaged, and it would have been my fault for creating barriers between my child and the person who could save her. That near miss fundamentally changed how I see immigrants and service workers, Corinne had continued. I used to make automatic assumptions about people based on their jobs. If someone was cleaning toilets or serving food, I consciously classified them as less educated or less capable than people in professional careers. Now, I recognize that assumption is both morally wrong and pragmatically stupid. The person mopping floors might be a nurse. The cashier might be a teacher. The Uber driver might be an engineer. Current job tells you nothing about actual qualifications or capabilities. Emma, now 5 years old, had no memory of the choking incident that had nearly killed her. But Corinne had made sure Emma knew the story of Mr. Juan who'd saved her life, framing it as a lesson about not judging people by appearance or assumptions. I want Emma to grow up understanding that the most important people in her life might not look like what society says important people should look like. Karen had explained. The man who saved her was wearing a janitor's uniform and had an accent, which are things I'd been taught to use as signals that someone wasn't worth respecting. But he had more expertise and capability than most people should ever meet. I want her to judge people by their character and actions rather than by superficial markers. 5 years after the train incident, Juan had been working as a pediatric emergency nurse in Baltimore for 3 years, had helped dozens of other immigrant nurses navigate the reformed licensing process in Maryland, and had become a nationally recognized voice on nursing workforce issues. He'd performed hundreds more airway emergency interventions, saving countless children using expertise that had once been wasted cleaning trains. Sometimes I think about all the years I spent unable to practice nursing, Juan had reflected during an interview for a nursing journal. The children I could have helped during those 8 years if I'd been allowed to use my expertise instead of cleaning trains. The families who suffered because America's licensing system decided my Mexican training wasn't valid despite being equivalent to or better than American training. That's time and lives we can never get back. But I also think about how my experience exposed problems that needed addressing, Juan had added. If I hadn't been on that train when Emma was choking, if that dramatic rescue hadn't happened with cameras rolling and witnesses watching, would anyone have paid attention to the licensing barriers affecting thousands of immigrant nurses? Probably not. Sometimes individual stories have to become public before systematic problems get addressed. The nursing licensing reform movement that Juan and others had championed had achieved significant victories by the 5-year mark. 15 states had passed expedited licensing pathways for internationally trained nurses. The NCLEX exam had been revised to reduce American-specific content that disadvantaged foreign test takers without assessing actual nursing competence. And several healthcare systems had created programs specifically to recruit and credential immigrant nurses, recognizing their value in addressing staffing shortages. We've made meaningful progress, Dr. Martinez had told me during a conversation about the advocacy work. But we're still wasting tremendous nursing talent. There are thousands of foreign-trained nurses in the U.S. who could be practicing if we had rational licensing systems. The Juan Rodriguez case opened doors and created momentum, but the work of actually reforming 50 state licensing boards is ongoing and difficult. As I sat finishing my lunch in the company cafeteria with my colleague, Roberto, the Colombian mechanical engineer who pushed mail carts, I wrapped up my retelling of Juan's story and checked my watch. Our break was ending, and we both needed to get back to our respective jobs before someone decided to lecture us about productivity. That's a powerful story, Roberto had said, gathering his lunch containers. Similar to a lot of immigrant professional experiences, highly qualified people doing survival jobs while fighting impossible bureaucratic systems. At least Juan eventually got through. Most of us never do. You're right, Ed agreed. Juan's story had that dramatic rescue that generated publicity and forced attention to licensing barriers. Most immigrant professionals don't get that kind of vindication moment. They just quietly work jobs beneath their qualifications while their expertise goes to waste. Which is why these stories matter, Roberto had replied. They remind people like me that we're not crazy for feeling undervalued. And maybe they open some eyes among Americans who had never thought about what the service workers around them might have done before they ended up serving. Speaking of which, I'd added as we'd headed toward the elevators. Tomorrow, if we meet up for lunch again, I can tell you about a situation I witnessed at a ski resort in Colorado. Lift operator everyone thought was just some uneducated mountain worker. Turned out to be an orthopedic surgeon from Colombia who prevented a tourist from becoming paralyzed after a bad skiing fall. You'd not be amazed at how many of these stories exist. Highly qualified immigrants doing whatever work they can get while people judge them without knowing who they'd be actually dealing with. I definitely want to hear that one. Roberto had confirmed as we reached the elevator bank. These stories help me feel less alone in this situation, you know? Knowing there are others who've been through similar struggles and sometimes make it through to the other side. That's exactly why Uncle Sam keeps telling them, I had replied. Not just for entertainment value, though they're certainly dramatic enough, but because they document a reality that millions of immigrants experience, having expertise that America desperately needs. But refusing to recognize because of systematic barriers, built around protectionism rather than actual quality assurance, bro. Now that we've finished our lunch break and I've told you one story, we gotta get back to work before some manager decides we're not being productive enough and tries to lecture us about company values. Though, honestly, after decades in security and consulting, I'd love to see them might remind them that the old security guy. Theory dismissing has forgotten more about threat assessment and crisis management than most executives will ever learn. But that's a conversation for another day. Tomorrow when we meet here again, assuming we both survive another day of corporate life without someone trying to micromanage us to death, remind me to tell you about that Colorado ski resort situation. It's another story about hidden credentials and dramatic rescue. But this time involving spinal injury and a lift operator who happened to be one of Columbia's top orthopedic surgeons. You're going to love it because it follows the same pattern. Entitled person dismissing immigrant worker. Emergency situation, worker reveals hidden expertise. Entitled person has to confront their own prejudice. Never gets old watching arrogance meet reality, you know? It'll be a real pleasure if we meet here again tomorrow, bro. And hey, if you've witnessed or experienced situations like what Juan went through, drop a comment and tell your story. Let people know what city and country you're from. Share experiences with qualified immigrants working survival jobs. Talk about the licensing barriers that prevent professionals from using their expertise, because these conversations matter. They remind people they're not alone in facing systematic obstacles. And they educate people who've never thought about the highly qualified professionals who might be serving their food, cleaning their offices, or driving their Ubers. So what do you think about nursing licensing barriers and how we treat immigrant medical professionals? Have you encountered foreign trained nurses or doctors working non-medical jobs because their credentials aren't recognized? Have you seen situations where someone's hidden expertise emerged during emergencies, forcing recognition that should have existed all along? I'd love to hear from you in the comments. Tell me your city and country. Share your stories about immigrant professionals you've met or barriers you've faced yourself. And big thank you to Maria Santos from Miami, Florida, and Kevin Tran from San Jose, California, who've been engaging with our previous videos. Maria, your story about your aunt who is a pharmacist in Cuba but works as a pharmacy technician here really connected with people. Kevin, appreciate you sharing how your father, who was an engineer in Vietnam, ended up working in a factory. Y'all keep those stories coming because they matter, and they help people understand the reality behind the statistics about immigrant women. The lesson from Han S. story remains clear. Expertise doesn't disappear just because licensing boards don't recognize it. Human value isn't determined by current job titles, and assumptions about people based on their work uniforms can be dangerously wrong. Juan Rodriguez was an exceptional pediatric nurse, whether he was saving children in Mexico City or cleaning trains in America. The only thing that changed was whether systems and people recognized that expertise and allowed him to use it. Because at the end of the day, America has a choice. We can continue maintaining protectionist licensing barriers that keep foreign trained nurses working as janitors while Americans die from nursing shortages. We can keep requiring immigrant medical professionals to repeat years of training they've already completed, wasting their expertise during the credentialing process. We can judge people by their current circumstances rather than their actual capabilities, dismissing service workers who might be more qualified than the professionals we pay hundreds of dollars to see. Or we can reform these systems to actually assess competence, recognize equivalent training regardless of origin, and utilize the tremendous medical expertise that immigrants bring to this country, Juan eventually got through after 8 years of fighting, 8 years during which his expertise was wasted. Children who could have benefited from his care didn't get access to his skills, and America's nursing shortage got worse while a qualified pediatric nurse cleaned trains. That waste should outrage us into demanding reform rather than just celebrating that one individual persisted through an impossible system. Because for every Juan Rodriguez who makes it through eventually, there are hundreds who give up, who can't afford the thousands in fees and years without income that credentialing requires, who age out of their clinical skills during decade-long licensing battles, or who just accept that America will never recognize their expertise and stop trying. Those are the nurses who stay cleaning offices, the doctors who keep driving Ubers, the medical professionals whose expertise dies with them because protectionist systems valued limiting competition over serving public health. Bro, that's the reality Uncle Sam has witnessed over 40 years of security work in medical facilities. Transportation, corporate environments, everywhere people from different backgrounds intersect. Highly qualified immigrants doing survival work while their expertise goes to waste. Facing discrimination from people who have no idea who they're actually dismissing. Occasionally getting dramatic vindication. When emergencies force recognition of their hidden qualifications, but usually just quietly enduring underemployment until they can navigate impossible licensing systems or give up trying. Anyway, Our lunch break is definitely over now, and I can see our manager looking our direction. Like they're reconsidering coming over to remind us about productivity expectations. Let's get back to work before we have to hear another lecture about corporate values from someone who wouldn't last a day doing what we actually do. But tomorrow, same time, same place. I'll tell you about the orthopedic surgeon working as a ski lift operator, and you can share whatever stories you've read out about hidden expertise in unexpected places. Thanks for listening to Uncle Sam S story about Juan and Emma, and that Amtrak train where one racist mother learned the hardest possible way that the people you dismiss might be the only ones who can save what you love most. These stories matter because they're happening constantly all around us. And maybe if enough people hear them, something changes about how we structure our professional licensing and how we treat people doing jobs that don't reflect their actual qualifications. Until tomorrow, bro, stay aware, treat everyone with respect regardless of their uniform. And remember that assumptions about people based on current circumstances are usually wrong and sometimes deadly.